Most hurricanes form in the southern Atlantic Ocean, and they form and they take several days to cross the Atlantic Ocean to reach the United States mainland. And so the idea of a last minute striking hurricane is generally seen as an impossibility. But what if I told you that there was one hurricane that formed so quickly that it made landfall 3 days after forming? So this is the story of Hurricane Alicia, a hurricane that I have survived. And Hurricane Alicia formed actually not typically, typically they, as I said, they form in the southern Atlantic Ocean. Alicia formed directly in the Gulf itself, and it formed based on the circulation of a passing cool front that passed over the central Gulf. Now in August, of course, the water temperatures of the Gulf are usually close to 90 degrees. So the conditions for a formation of a hurricane off the tail end of a cold front with circulation already running counterclockwise, it could form around the center or around the tail end of that cold front and immediately build. This occurred on August 15th of 1983. On August 15th of 1983, the storm formed around the center on the tail end of said cold front, and it formed in the central Gulf, which is unusual, but not given the temperatures and conditions in the Gulf. Looking back, you can't exactly call it a surprise. The hurricane developed very rapidly. Under these conditions, of course, it's going to intensify rapidly, to the point where by August 17th, or a mere 2 days later, this hurricane was already a Category 3 with maximum sustained winds of around 115 miles an hour. The hurricane then made a beeline for the Texas coast. Given that it was already in the central Gulf, it only took a day to get to the coastline. So on August 18th, a night that I will never forget personally, living in southwestern Houston at the time, Alicia made landfall on the western tip of Galveston Island, which of course has its own hurricane history, but Galveston felt the first effects of Alicia, and of course then it made a beeline naturally from there up I-45 towards downtown Houston. The storm surge on this particular storm wasn't particularly strong. Part of the problem was that the overall force was enough to cause about 3 foot of subsidence of Galveston Island itself. So a 3-foot drop in land, that suddenly was going to create basically a lake effect, a flooding effect on Galveston Island. Now, the effect that it had on downtown Houston is still the stuff of history. Almost every skyscraper in downtown Houston in 1983, on that fateful night, had the entire lower half of the building's windows blown entirely out. So you had a whole bunch of skyscrapers with no windows remaining on the lower levels whatsoever. Every single piece was blown out. I remember the glass in downtown Houston on this one. The glass was several feet deep on the streets of downtown Houston, because that's how much glass we're talking about here. The thing also to remember is that because of the speed at which the storm developed and it struck the mainland, business travelers were lined up at payphones at both Houston airports that lasted for hours, with people trying to call their family and friends back home at both Intercontinental and Hobby airports. Of course, cell phones didn't exist at this point and wouldn't exist for another, at least 15 years. But Alicia at this time wound up becoming mainly on the strength of that particular damage in downtown Houston itself. At the time, in 1983, Hurricane Alicia was the most expensive hurricane in American history. $3 billion in 1983 money. Think about that for a minute. I'd be like, what, $8 or $9 billion today? Granted, Katrina wound up becoming more expensive. But at the time, $3 billion in damage was unheard of. And again, because of the value of the property in downtown Houston, which sustained the most damage, this is why the figure was so high. Now, fatalities is concerned, very small, 21. Unfortunately, the number of injured was also somewhere in the region of 7,000 to 8,000. Shelter at that particular time was pretty strong. By the time we got to 1983, building codes had been brought up, and of course, southeastern Texas was already well known to be a hurricane, a prime hurricane zone. So building codes were up to relatively strong levels at this point. So this kept the fatalities down. But the speed of the hurricane, building and developing, prevented very large-scale evacuations from occurring because there just wasn't enough time. So this is the natural, this hurricane could have been part of a natural catastrophe type of movie with how quickly it develops. It's absolutely unheard of for a hurricane to develop and already be striking a major metropolitan area 3 days later. It's the only time in history it's ever happened. I mean, even the strongest storms in history, such as Katrina striking New Orleans in 2005, they had much more time than Houston and Galveston did in 1983. They had well over a week. Houston had 3 days. So yes, this is that nightmare scenario that you could build a movie around. I'm kind of surprised nobody has, but there it is. The nightmare scenario, the rapid-fire hurricane that built up and struck a major metropolitan area in a little less than 3 days from formation. The story of Hurricane Alicia in August of 1983. Again, a storm I lived through. A storm in which I woke up the next morning and stepped outside my door and found a downed power line right in front of our door. Therefore, we couldn't leave for a while until Houston Light and Power, HL&P, could come along and clean it up. It's a pretty lousy way to get stranded and locked in, isn't it? So that's the story. Same day filming again. Hopefully you enjoyed your Friday Junior. And we'll see you tomorrow night. As always, peace out, homies.